Hello, my wandering listener. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Is it early morning where the light is pale and kind, or deep in the night when only the stars keep watch? Close your eyes and let time soften around you. Tonight, I will tell you one of the oldest stories ever whispered under heaven. The journey of a dreamer named Joseph, whose faith carried him from the darkness of a well to the throne of a kingdom, and whose light, once hidden, became the hope of nations. This is not just a tale of sorrow and triumph, but a story of patience, destiny, and love that survives every distance. So breathe slowly and let the story begin. In the land of Canaan, where the wind drifted through groves of olive and fig, and the mountains glowed amber beneath the evening sun, there lived a boy whose soul shimmered like the morning light. His name was Joseph. The nights in Canaan were quiet and endless. When the shepherds gathered their flocks and the fires dimmed, the heavens opened like a scroll of silver. The stars above were so clear that each one seemed alive, whispering secrets to those who could listen. Joseph listened. Even as a child, he could feel the hum of creation in the silence. He was the son of Jacob, grandson of Isaac, descendant of Abraham, the lineage of promise. Yet Joseph's life was not one of kings and warriors. It began among shepherds, with dust on his feet and the scent of grass and milk on his hands. His world was simple. The laughter of his younger brother Benjamin, the creak of leather harnesses, the songs of women grinding grain in the courtyard, and the stories his father told by the fire, stories of angels, ladders reaching to heaven, and covenants sealed beneath the desert stars. Jacob loved Joseph deeply, perhaps too deeply. The boy reminded him of Rachel, his beloved wife, the one whose memory still softened Jacob's eyes even after years of absence. Rachel had died bringing Benjamin into the world, but in Joseph, her gentleness lived on. His voice was calm, his manner tender, and there was something in his gaze that unsettled even grown men, a purity untouched by malice, a light that seemed both fragile and eternal. Jacob gave him a robe, a coat woven with threads of crimson and sapphire, ivory and gold. It was more than a garment, it was a sign, a blessing made visible. When Joseph wore it, sunlight danced upon the fabric, and his brothers' hearts darkened. They saw how their father's eyes lingered on Joseph, how his words softened when he spoke the boy's name. They remembered the long days they had spent in the fields, unseen, unpraised, while Joseph remained near the tents, his hands uncalloused, his dreams filled with heaven. And dreams, yes, dreams followed him like shadows of light. One night, beneath the cool hush of early dawn, Joseph woke trembling. The world felt too bright, as though the veil between earth and sky had thinned. He stepped outside, barefoot, the hem of his robe brushing the dew. Over the distant hills, the stars still burned. He lifted his eyes to them, and the dream returned with vivid clarity. I saw, he whispered to himself, the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing before me. The vision had not been frightening. It was beautiful, filled with warmth and music and the strange ache of destiny. Yet even he, in his innocence, could sense its weight. Later that morning, as birds began to scatter gold across the sky, he went to his father. Jacob was seated by the doorway, his hands weaving cords for a water skin. He looked up, smiling softly, for Joseph's face always brought a kind of peace to him. "Father," Joseph said quietly, kneeling beside him, I dreamed again last night. Jacob's hands paused. Tell me, my son, what did you see? Joseph told him everything. The blazing sun, the silver moon, the 11 stars that circled him and bent low in reverence. When he finished, the silence between them deepened. Jacob stared into the distance, his mind reaching toward the meaning behind the dream. At last he spoke. This dream, he murmured, is not of this earth. But you must keep it close, my son. Do not share it with your brothers. Light is a burden too great for those who live in shadow. Joseph bowed his head, but the words, innocent as he was, escaped him before long. Perhaps he thought the dream too wondrous not to share. Perhaps he simply did not see the danger in their eyes. When he spoke of it to his brothers, they laughed at first. But their laughter was sharp, like flint striking steel. So you think you will rule over us? One said, his voice cutting through the air. You, the dreamer? Maybe we will bow to you, said another, when sheep fly and stones bear fruit. They mocked him, yet their jealousy deepened, coiling like smoke in their chests. Every time Joseph passed, they fell silent, watching. Even his gentleness became unbearable to them. His kindness felt like a mirror showing their own hardness. Days turned into weeks. Joseph continued to dream. He dreamed of rivers swelling into gold, of fields bending under invisible hands, of a voice calling from beyond the clouds. He dreamed of loss and redemption without understanding either. He would wake with tears in his eyes and not know why. Jacob, watching him from afar, felt the old ache of prophecy stirring again. He remembered his own dream, long ago. The ladder of light, angels ascending and descending. And he feared, as all fathers do, that what was divine in his son might also draw suffering. Sometimes, when the moon rose pale over the desert, Jacob would pray aloud, Lord of my fathers, make his path gentle. Let the fire that burns within him not consume him before its time. But destiny listens in its own language. The seasons changed. Canaan's hills turned from green to gold. The flocks multiplied, and so did the bitterness among the brothers. They spoke in whispers when Joseph was near, their words hidden behind forced laughter. Only Benjamin loved him without jealousy. The little boy followed him everywhere, holding his hand, laughing at his stories. They would sit by the stream together, throwing pebbles into the water and watching the ripples fade. One evening, Joseph looked up from the stream and said, Benjamin, do you ever think the stars can see us? Benjamin tilted his head. If they can, I hope they know we're not trying to shine as bright as them. Joseph smiled. Maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe we're just meant to remember their light when the night grows dark. He said it simply, but those words would echo for years. Through shadow, through prison, through the palace of Egypt. For now, he was still a boy in Canaan. The world was vast, his heart untested. Yet somewhere, beyond the horizon, destiny was already walking toward him, quiet as dawn. And above him, the 11 stars still waited. Morning light spilled across the hills of Canaan like the pouring of honey. The sky glowed soft gold, and the shepherds were already awake, their voices calling to the sheep across the plains. The air smelled of milk and wild thyme. Dust swirled around bare ankles as the brothers gathered near the pens. They were men of the land, broad-shouldered, rough-handed, born to the rhythm of wind and sweat. Reuben, the eldest, bore the quiet weight of responsibility. Simeon and Levi, quick-tempered, their laughter sharp as flint. Judah, steady-eyed and thoughtful, hiding ambition behind calm. Issachar, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Zebulun. Their names were like stones laid upon each other, building a lineage of pride. But among them moved one who did not seem of their kind. Joseph. He was younger, slender, and still boyish, yet there was a grace in him that made people pause. When he walked, dust did not cling to him the same way. When he spoke, the air seemed to hush, as if even the wind leaned closer to listen. They did not understand him, nor he them. The others were sons of Leah and the handmaids. Joseph was the son of Rachel, the woman Jacob had truly loved. Perhaps that was where the trouble began. Not in Joseph's doing, but in a memory older than him. Jacob loved all his sons, but Joseph was different. When he looked upon the boy, his eyes softened into something wordless, an ache, a remembrance, a prayer. He saw in him the reflection of Rachel's smile, her patience, her light. So Jacob gave him a gift, a robe unlike any other. It was long, woven of fine threads, dyed in deep scarlet, ocean blue, and golden flax. When the sun touched it, it gleamed like rippling water. Joseph wore it proudly at first, unaware of what it stirred in the hearts around him. His brothers saw the robe not as beauty, but as a wound. It was proof of what they had always known, but never spoken, that their father's love had borders, and they stood outside them. Sometimes, while tending the flocks, they would see Joseph walking from afar, the colors of his robe flashing like fire among the rocks, and bitterness would rise like bile in their throats. "Look at him," Simeon would mutter. "The little prince of father's house." "Too fine to herd sheep," Levi would add. "And too proud to eat with us," Gad said. Only Reuben looked away, sighing. "He is still our brother." But the word brother began to sound hollow on their tongues. Joseph did not mean to provoke. He was gentle, and his heart knew no malice. Yet there was a light in him that could not be hidden, a light that spoke through his dreams. One night he dreamed that he and his brothers were binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly his sheaf rose upright, while theirs gathered around and bowed to it. He awoke before dawn, trembling with excitement. It was not pride that filled him, but wonder, the awe of having touched something beyond the world of soil and sheep. And so, at breakfast, he told them. "We were binding sheaves," he said, eyes bright, "and my sheaf stood tall while yours bowed down before it." The silence that followed was heavy. The crackle of the fire seemed to mock him. "So," said Simeon slowly, "you think you'll rule over us?" Levi laughed, but his laughter had no joy. "Our little dreamer wants a crown." Joseph frowned, confused. "No, I thought perhaps it was a sign. A sign that you've lost your senses," Judah said coldly. Joseph fell silent. His spoon lay untouched beside his bowl. The others went back to eating, but their eyes lingered on him, each bite tasting faintly of resentment. That night, he dreamed again, of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to him in radiance. He told it to his father this time, and Jacob pondered. "Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed bow to you?" he said gently. Yet deep within, he felt the tremor of destiny, as one who once dreamed beneath a ladder of light. But the brothers heard of it, and the wound deepened. After that, Joseph's presence among them became unbearable. They watched his every move, The way Jacob smiled when he spoke, the way he carried himself, how even strangers seemed drawn to his voice. Sometimes, when Joseph came to the fields, the wind carried his laughter before him. The brothers would look up from their labor, and for a moment the whole world seemed to pause, brightened by that sound. And then, just as swiftly, shadow returned. Envy is quiet at first. It begins like a thorn beneath the skin, too small to notice. But left to fester, it grows until it becomes a flame that burns through reason. And so the flame spread among them. It smoldered in silence during meals, flickered in their glances, darkened their sleep. Even Reuben, the eldest, began to feel the weight of comparison, how his father rarely called for him anymore, how Joseph's name alone softened Jacob's voice. Only Benjamin, still a child, loved Joseph freely. He would follow him around the camp, clutching his robe, asking questions about stars, angels, and the stories of their forefathers. Joseph never tired of answering. He would lie beside the boy under the fig trees, describing the heavens as though he had walked among them. "Do you think dreams are real?" Benjamin asked once. Joseph smiled. "I think they are more real than anything we can touch. They come from the place where God speaks softly." Benjamin nodded sleepily. "Then maybe God loves you more because he speaks to you often." Joseph's eyes clouded. "No," he said softly. "Maybe he speaks to all of us. But I am the only one foolish enough to listen." The boy fell asleep beside him. Above them, the stars burned cold and pure, their light reaching across centuries to witness the birth of destiny. At night, the brothers gathered around the fire, speaking little. Sometimes they spoke of the flocks, sometimes of trade. But often the talk circled back to Joseph. "What will Father leave us?" asked Dan one night. "He has given Joseph everything already." Judah stared into the fire. A dreamer's gift is not wealth. But dreams can poison hearts. Levi tossed a stick into the flames. "Then perhaps the cure is to wake him from dreaming," the others murmured. The word wake hung in the air, its meaning shifting like smoke. In those days, the land of Canaan slept under a red moon. Even the earth seemed restless. Jackals cried across the valleys. Somewhere far away, a caravan bell jingled faintly, a warning the brothers did not hear. Fate was drawing near, softly and visibly, like the wind that bends grass before the storm. And in the distance, Jacob prayed in his tent, unaware that the seed of sorrow had already sprouted in his own house. Dawn thinned the darkness like silk drawn over a lamp. Smoke curled from the cooking fire in Jacob's camp, and the bleating of sheep rose with the light. Jacob sat near the doorway of his tent, fingers working a leather cord, the old ache in his bones reminding him of journeys past. When Joseph approached, the morning seemed to lift its head. "My son," Jacob said, studying Joseph's face the way a thirsty man studies a spring. "Your brother's pasture near Shechem. Go, I pray you, and see whether it is well with them and with the flocks." Joseph's heart brightened with the small happiness of being useful. "I will go, Father." Jacob's hand hovered, then rested on the boy's shoulder, light, reluctant, loving. "Wear a plain cloak if you wish," he murmured. But Joseph, thinking nothing of danger, drew the colored robe around him and smiled. He set out while dew still clung to the grass like tiny stars. The path unfurled between thistle and rock. Larks sprang from the scrub with silver cries. The scent of wild mint crushed beneath his sandals followed him, the earth's breath warm and close. Joseph walked with a steady rhythm, prayer hidden in his chest like a bird in a nest. By midday, the hills shook with heat. The horizon trembled. Joseph paused to drink from a skin, then pressed on, asking a stranger in the field, "Have you seen my brothers?" "They have gone from here," the man replied, shading his eyes. "I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" "Dothan?" Joseph repeated, and thanked him with the grateful nod of the young. He turned north, into lands where the wind sang low and endless. Far off, like a scrap of flame moving over pale stone, the brothers saw him coming. The robe betrayed him before his face did. Simeon spat into the dust. "There," he said, "the dream comes on 2 feet." Levi's mouth tightened. How convenient the heavens have sent him alone. Judah's eyes were flint. This is the hour when shadows choose whether to lengthen or withdraw. Dan's laugh was short. "Let us lengthen them, then." Reuben, standing a little apart, felt the old tug between duty and silence. He loved his father and, in a way he could not name, he loved Joseph too. The boy's innocence made even Reuben's failures ache less. "Do not kill him," he said, voice rough as stone. "Shed no blood. Cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but lay no hand upon him." He had a plan, secret even to himself, to come back under cover of dusk and lift the boy out. "Agreed," Judah said, though the word tasted like iron. Joseph reached them with a dust-bright smile. "Brothers," he called, lifting a hand, "peace be to you." "Father asked me." The greeting dissolved as hands seized him. The world tilted. Stone, glare, breath, shouts. Fingers bit into his arms. Simeon's grip was a shackle. Levi's, a verdict. Joseph's robe tore open with a rip of woven light, and for an instant the cloth hung in the air. A startled bird before collapsing in the dust. "Brothers," he gasped, staring from face to face for sense, for mercy, for the old games of childhood to reveal themselves. None did. "Down with the dream," someone said. They dragged him to an ancient cistern scribed into the earth, a mouth of shadow rimmed with white salt. The pit breathed a cool rot, a memory of rain long vanished. Joseph tried to speak. "I have done you no harm." But the sentence broke as his feet skidded, and then he fell. The wall flashed past him, a gray blur of flint and old roots, and the ground rose with a blunt, bruising certainty. Pain rang through his ribs. For a moment, all he could hear was his own breath, a saw through dry wood. Above, a jagged circle of sky burned, haloed by his brothers' silhouettes. Their faces were coins held too far away to read. Then they were gone. Silence pooled in the pit, deep and metallic. Dust drifted in sunbeams like drowned gold. Joseph lay still, testing his limbs, tasting iron and grit. Fear came in waves, but beneath it a quieter current glided, the remembrance of a dream, the slow bowing of lights. He pressed a palm to the cool stone and whispered, almost apologetically, "Lord, I am here." Above, the brothers sat to eat. The bread was coarse and hot. The dates stuck to their fingers. Every bite was saltier than it should have been. "Will you not bless the food?" Asher asked, half in jest, half to push the moment away from the brink it hovered over. Levi laughed without mirth. "Let the dreamer bless us from below." Reuben's appetite withered. He rose abruptly. "I must check the far flock," he lied, and walked until the voices shrank to flies. He lifted his hands to the white vault of noon and closed his eyes. "I will return for him," he vowed. The words a knot pulled tight around his heart. The sun rolled. Heat clung to the ground. In the pit, Joseph counted his breaths, then the soft drips of powder from the walls, then the distant percussion of hooves. At first imagined, then real, then undeniable. A bell rang once, twice, far as a star. On the ridge, a caravan unstitched itself from the horizon. Camels stepping like patient engines, necks ribboned with colored cords. Men wrapped in linen the color of sand, goat skins swollen with balm. Jars of gum and myrrh clinking softly like muted chimes. Spices breathed a dark sweetness into the bright air. Judah watched, thoughts moving like chessmen across an invisible board. "What profit?" he said slowly, "if we kill our brother and cover his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and our hand shall not be upon him. For he is our brother and our flesh." The sentence found a path that murder could not, a cruelty that felt, to those who needed it to feel so, like a lesser thing. They agreed. Ropes went down. Joseph, blinking up from the circle of sky, saw the cords sway above him like ladders without angels. He did not resist. He was too tired for struggle, and he would not plead. Hands tugged. Stone grazed his knees. Sun stabbed his eyes. Then he stood again among them, bare-shouldered, stripped of the garment that had once made him a miracle in his father's camp. Judah did not meet his gaze. Simeon did, and looked away first. Levi's jaw nodded. "Why?" Joseph asked. Not as accusation, but as a child asks about the shape of rain. "Because dreams have teeth," Judah said, "and because we are tired of being their meat." They led him to the caravan master like a lamb whose bleeding had already finished somewhere inside its chest. Haggling began, the old desert liturgy of price. Fingers flashed, heads tilted. 20 pieces of silver weighed out into a leather palm. The coins clicked like small verdicts. A thong-bound chain was looped around Joseph's wrists. The leather was warm from other captives. He did not look back until the camels had turned toward the road. When he did, the brothers were smaller than he remembered, their shapes bending under the hard light. The world narrowed to sway and dust and the drumbeat of padded feet. Reuben returned to an emptiness. He ran to the pit, called once, twice, then saw the scuffed marks of ropes, the churned dust, the absence shaped like a cry. He tore his clothes, an old grief gesture cracking open like a new wound. The boy is not. And I, whither shall I go? The question fell back on him with no answer. He was the eldest. Failure wore his face. The problem of their father rose like a wall. It was Levi who said the word they all were trying not to think: blood. They took a young goat from the herd. Its eyes were as mild as Joseph's had been, and for a second Simeon felt something loosen in his chest. But only for a second. The knife did its work. Red sheeted into a bowl. The smell, hot copper, violent, climbed their throats. They dipped the torn robe into the goat's life. Scarlet took the cloth greedily, veining the threads until the many colors drowned beneath one. When they lifted it, it dripped a sorrow that looked like proof. Evening gathered its blue skirts about the tents when they returned. Jacob sat where he had sat at dawn, as though the hours between were a trick of light. "We found this," Judah said, not lying, not telling the truth. He held out the robe with careful hands, as if the fabric might burn him. "Do you know whether it is your son's coat or not?" Jacob reached for it and then did not. The air between his fingers and the cloth trembled. He took it at last, and the world narrowed to weave and stain, to the remembered seam where Rachel once teased him for fussing, to the patch Joseph insisted on stitching himself when a thorn snagged it. A childish repair barely visible if you did not know where to look. Jacob knew. "It is my son's coat," he said, the words climbing from a mind deeper than speech. "An evil beast has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces." The tent became a valley, and his cry ran along it like a river after drought. He tore his garments, sackcloth rasping his skin like a penance he had not been offered a choice about. Ash found his hair. He refused comfort the way a wound refuses a touch. "I will go down to my son mourning, into Sheol," he said. And the name of the underworld tasted like iron and salt. Daughters wept. Sons stumbled over phrases of consolation that shattered in their mouths. Each of them saw, as if in a cruel mirror, the thin line dividing deed and consequence. Only Benjamin, bewildered, wandered between tents, asking whether anyone had seen Joseph, perhaps by the stream where they threw pebbles, perhaps under the fig where stories lived. No one answered him in a language he could use. Night fell with a slow, absolute gentleness that made the day's violence feel even louder. Somewhere a flute played a broken tune. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing. Above the camp, stars pricked the fabric of the sky, cold, innumerable, the same stars that had bent once in a dream. On the road to Egypt, the caravan moved like a dark sentence written across sand. The camels' shadows swam beside them. Spices breathed an orchard in the night, resin sweet, pine dark, almost a comfort if one did not know what comfort cost. Joseph sat bound, the thong warm against his skin, wrists tender where the leather kissed too tightly. He counted the steps between bells, the breaths between gusts of wind, the memories between griefs. He thought of Jacob's hands, the weight of the robe on his shoulders, the taste of bread still warm from the stones. He thought of Benjamin's questions about stars. His throat tightened, not with tears, but with the effort of keeping faith articulate. He lifted his face to the sky, a blue-black sea spilling its lights. The constellations watched from their old thrones. "If the dream is from you," he whispered inside himself, "then you are here also, in the pit on the road, within the chain." No answer came but the clean indifference of starlight, which is also a kind of answer, ancient and exact. The bell rang once. The desert inhaled, exhaled. The caravan flowed on, a long artery carrying him away from everything his name had meant. Behind him, grief lay in a tent where a father tried to sleep inside a torn garment. Before him, Egypt's gates waited, tall as unslept nights, bright as knives. He did not yet know that the same hand that permitted descent would kindle ascent, that prisons could be thresholds, that hunger could be a grammar for abundance. For now, he closed his eyes and let the sway of the camel rock him. The wind touched his hair with the intimacy of a mother he barely remembered. Somewhere near his ear, a trader's prayer rose and fell in another tongue. He did not understand the words, but he recognized the angle of the heart. Far behind, on a ridge, Reuben stood alone, head bowed, the last light bleeding out of the stones. He pressed his palms to his eyes until stars burst inside the dark, cheap, private constellations. "Forgive me," he said to no one, to everyone, to the God of his father who measures men not only by what they do, but also by what they are too weak to undo. Night completed itself. Silence returned to its work. And the dreamer, no longer a boy, not yet a man, traveled toward the city where dreams are priced, measured, and sometimes realized. Evening unspooled over Canaan with the softness of worn linen, and the wind that moved through the tents smelled faintly of ashes and crushed figs. After the long day, the camp should have settled into its old, faithful rhythm. Goats nosing at their troughs, children chasing shadows, women singing low near the grinding stones. But grief had entered Jacob's tent like a sovereign and overturned the order of things. The blood-darkened robe lay across his knees. The threads, once a festival of color, now drank a single shade as if sorrow were the only dye the world possessed. Jacob's fingers traced the hem, then the small, clumsy mend where a thorn had snagged it weeks ago, and Joseph insisted on making the repair himself. An uneven stitch like a child's heartbeat. The sight of it undid him. He bent over the cloth, and his voice, when it rose, sounded like a rope breaking in a well. Joseph, my son. Servants gathered and then backed away, their hands hovering uselessly between offering comfort and respecting the holy space of a father's cry. Daughters wept. The sound braided itself with the thin whistle of the kettle and the rattle of date pits in a wooden bowl. Grief made time irregular. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. Someone's shadow shivered on the tent wall as if it were a living thing startled by its own shape. The brothers sat apart, their bodies arranged like stones in a cairn, meaningful in their closeness, mute in their purpose. No one met anyone's eyes for long. The robe had done its work too perfectly. They had expected relief, that cool emptiness a lie sometimes promises. Instead, they felt a heat under the skin, a low fever of seeing their father bent in a posture no story could straighten. Reuben's hands would not be still. He kept folding and unfolding a strip of leather until it frayed and left a dark grit along his palms. Simeon chewed at his lip until it bled. Levi stared at the lamp flame with a soldier's stare, willing himself into hardness and finding a soft place he had not known he possessed. Judah's face held the unreadable calm of a man, counting debts in a language he hoped no one else spoke. Outside, night completed itself. The sky pressed close, a velvet lid studded with cold light. The smell of trampled grass and sheep sweat thinned, replaced by the metallic tang of cooling earth. Somewhere, a jackal called, a single note pulled from the ribs of the hill. The sound seemed to ask a question the brothers could not answer. Jacob tore his garments. Sackcloth found his skin, the scratch of it loudly honest. Ash dusted his hair like an early frost. When hands reached to lift him, he shook them off, without rage, without hope. A father's refusal to be comforted is not drama. It is a vow. I will go down to my son mourning. To Sheol, he said. And the syllables struck the tent poles like stones in a river, softened by passage, louder for being soft. In the men's circle, silence swelled until it became speech of another kind. Asher finally said the only words he could manage. Eat. No one moved. Then, as if by covenant, they each took a piece of bread and held it without lifting it to their mouths. When Judah did at last chew, it sounded to him like walking on dry leaves where he had once walked on water. He swallowed hard and felt the bread go down like a lie that had learned to live in a human throat. Benjamin wandered the camp with a lamp too large for his hand. Have you seen him? He asked the air, his sisters, the sheep, the ground. Joseph says the stars can hear us. Joseph says dreams are doors. The lamp flame pushed a gold circle ahead of his small feet, and he looked into it for his brother's shadow. the way children look into ponds for a face that is not their own. When he lifted the tent flap and saw the robe, he did not understand the geometry of grief, but he saw its color. He pressed his lips together and sat beside Jacob, placing his small palm on the old man's sleeve, as if a child's hand could be an anchor thrown into a storm. Jacob's mind reeled backward and downward into memory. Rachel's laughter under a date palm, the terror and tenderness of holding Joseph's newborn weight, the tilt of sunlight on a boy's cheekbone as he asked questions the world could not answer, the way the family's evening would change pitch when Joseph entered, as if someone had tuned the air. He remembered the dream retold in the hush of morning, the sun and moon and 11 stars booing. He had rebuked the boy with a smile that had fear in it. He had asked him to keep the dream quiet, and now the dream had gone quiet in the worst way a dream can. He lifted the robe to his face and smelled goat and iron, and under that, the faint trace of the oil Joseph liked, olive pressed with sprigged mint, a scent so thin that only a father would think he recognized it. He rocked as if old grief were a cradle and new grief a child. Outside the circle of lamplight, the camp listened. Listening is a way a place can mourn. The fig leaves clicked together. The ash settled. In the women's tent, someone sang a low song about wells and daughters. The words did their old work of mending, though tonight each stitch slipped. The brothers rose in turns to go about small tasks, binding a cord, checking a tether, putting away a jar, as if labor were a liturgy that might rebuild what speech had broken. Each task returned them to the same center, the tent where their father's breath moved like a bellows working a fire that produced no flame. Reuben came to the doorway and stood there a long time, a tall shadow trying not to be. He whispered so softly that only he could hear. Had I come sooner? Had I insisted? Had I? The sentence frayed into the same dark thread that frayed his hands. He could not enter. He could not leave. He was the gate that would not open and would not shut. Judah went out beyond the last tethering pin, past the place where the ground changed grain and the hills began their low bruised rise. He lifted his eyes and found the familiar map. Orion's belt, the small crooked glow that marked the shepherd's tail of a bull. The fever-bright cluster he'd once compared to a handful of millet flung into wet ink. Above these, a wider silence. What profit? He had asked earlier, when profit had seemed like a word that could save them. Now the word tasted of tin. He pressed his tongue to his teeth the way a man tests a knife's edge, and found it dull. Simeon and Levi sat shoulder to shoulder and said nothing. It was the best they could offer each other. A joint refusal to speak into a night that had already said too much. Dan counted his pulse until the numbers turned into sheep. Naphtali untied and retied the thong on his sandal. Zebulun stared at his hands and saw that they were clean and felt that they were not. Asher, always the peacemaker, rehearsed sentences of comfort that curdled before they left his mouth. Issachar lay back and let the ground hold his weight because his bones could not. Gad walked the perimeter as if a boarder might keep in or keep out what grief ignores. In the hour when lamps burn low and conversations fall into the seams of sleep, a new sound arrived. A far bell, so faint it might have been an artifact of the mind. It belonged to nothing the camp could see. But if one had followed the note across the dark fields, over the spine of the low hills, down into the long corridor of desert, one would have found the caravan, a ribbon of shadow stitched with dull lights, moving south like a solemn sentence. Joseph rode with his wrists bound, the leather having warmed to his skin as if it were a new layer grown in haste. The night's breath smelled of myrrh and camel, and the secret sweetness that comes when spices give themselves up to air. Sand ticked off the camel's pads. The bells marked a time older than the one the sun keeps. The traders spoke in an easy murmur that rose and fell like tide against a seawall. Prices, wells, stars' names. A story about a storm that had once shaken a city built on reeds. Joseph kept his eyes open until the stars began to double, as if the sky were a broken mirror reassembling itself. He watched the familiar pattern slide across the cold vault and whispered their names under his breath. Ancestral syllables that felt like doors he could open with his tongue. Words his father had taught him, words his mother's memory had perfumed. The constellations did not bow. They endured. Endurance, he discovered, is also a kind of blessing. He thought of the pit, not its depth, but its temperature, the clean surprise of cool in a day of heat. He thought of the moment the rope brushed his shoulder, how rescue and purchase can feel the same to the body, though they are not the same to the soul. He thought of Jacob's hand on his head that morning, light and reluctant, as if a father's blessing were both giving and letting go. He did not think long of the robe. Clothes are the surface a life shows. He had lost one surface and found another. A skin of dust, a sheen of salt, the welt the thong made. Beneath these, the old garment of faith was still wearable. He put it on again in the dark and found that it fit differently now. Tighter across the ribs, looser around the throat, a garment for a man who must breathe smaller and speak less and listen more. The caravan halted at a hollow in the land where wind had combed the sand into soft shoulders. Fires were coaxed from ember to flame. Water measured itself out of skins with the diplomacy of need. A trader set a bowl of barley beside Joseph without looking at him. Not unkindly, not kindly. Joseph ate. Hunger shrinks a world to a bowl and then enlarges it again once the bowl is empty. When he finished, he lifted his hands, bound though they were, and thanked the giver of grain. Gratitude has many postures. Bound hands find one of their own. He slept then, if the long falling inside the mind counts as sleep. His dreaming was not of thrones and stars. It was the slow memory of a stream in Canaan and the gentle argument it made with stones. The weight of Benjamin's head on his shoulder, the warm shadow of a fig leaf on a page of sand. When he woke before dawn, the horizon was a bruise about to bloom into light. Back in Canaan, Jacob had not slept. Exhaustion had worked itself into him and still could not undo him. In the hour when roosters rehearse confidence and the cold is at its cleanest, he rose and went outside. The sky's eastern rim held a seam of pale fire. He stood with his hands hanging, not in surrender. He had nothing to surrender, but in a posture returned to men stripped of the theater of control. God of my fathers, he said, voice worn thin, if I have any favor left with you, spend it where my sight cannot. If he breathes, teach him how to breathe. If he walks, set a floor beneath his feet. If he is gone, keep what remains of me from spoiling. The words did not change the air, but the saying of them changed the man speaking. Prayer is sometimes a bridge that does not cross a river, but reminds a mourner what rivers are. The brothers heard him, some with a flinch, some with a dullness that felt like armor, some with a pain that refused to choose between confession and concealment. The pact between them, drafted in dust, held. Men will share a secret long after they have lost the reason for it. And so the night ended. In Canaan, with a father bent beneath a robe that could no longer warm. On the road, with a captive rousing to the first thin gold of an alien dawn. Between them lay distance, and between distance lay time, and between time lay the small, precise mercies by which a story advances without ceasing to be a wound. The caravan rose and gathered itself into motion. Hooves found their cadence. Bells counted the morning. Joseph watched the sun take possession of the sky with the quiet authority of the familiar acting strange. He tasted dust and something like resolve. Egypt waited, a country that believed in the arithmetic of grain and dreams, a place where mouths ate the years and years fed the mouths. Joseph did not yet know its streets or its gods, its prisons or its titles. He knew only the stubborn companionship of the one who inhabits pit and palace without contradiction. Behind him, Canaan's fields brightened. Ahead, desert wrote its long sentence. The dream, ridiculed, sold, blooded, bound, did not die. It changed shape. It traveled like a seed under a hoofprint, pressed down, carried forward, keeping its map folded inside itself. And the stars, which once bowed in a boy's night, kept their cold, exact positions, as if to say, "We do not move for men. We witness movement within them." The road from Canaan unrolled like a scar across the desert. Day after day the caravan moved, camels sighing, wheels singing, dust rising into heat that trembled like glass. At night, stars wheeled above in their endless patient order. And Joseph, bound among strangers, learned the language of silence. He had left the hills of his father's house, the smell of figs and goat's milk, the gentle calling of his brothers' voices across the pasture. Now his world was rhythm, the slow thud of hooves, the ring of bells, the creak of leather and rope. He did not know where the path would end, but he felt beneath everything that he was being carried toward a design larger than grief. On the seventh morning, when the desert thinned and the wind began to smell faintly of water, Joseph first saw Egypt. It rose from the horizon like a mirage. Towers of red stone and glimmering white, palms bending over canals, sails moving along the wide blue flank of the Nile. The river itself was a god in motion, coiling and glittering beneath the sun, feeding fields greener than anything he had imagined. The air was thick with the scent of life. Incense, sweat, papyrus, baked bread, lotus, copper, resin, and the sweetness of ripe dates. The traders straightened their robes. Even camels lifted their heads higher, aware that they were entering a place of consequence. Joseph watched in wonder. He had known sand and sky. Now he saw stone teaching the earth how to last. Columns carved with wings and suns rose like prayers that had turned to architecture. The language on the walls ran in colors: reds, blacks, blues, hieroglyphs like insects frozen in flight. They passed through gates taller than trees, guarded by statues of lions with human eyes. Within, the city pulsed. Men shouted prices, women carried baskets of grain, children ran laughing through pillars. Drums beat in the distance. Somewhere, a flute wound its thin silver through the noise. Joseph was led through streets crowded with color. Sunlight flashed on bronze bracelets and the smooth black hair of the women. From balconies, parrots screamed. The smell of honey and sweat mingled until even the air seemed golden. He thought of his father's tents. How small and still they seemed now, and felt both awe and ache. Yet within that ache, something stirred, a quiet certainty that the dream had not ended. It had merely changed its language. The slave market lay at the edge of the square, where the Nile's wind mixed with dust and the cries of hawkers. Wooden platforms stood beneath canopies of dyed linen, red, ochre, turquoise, each shadowed by a crowd. Chains clinked softly as men shifted their weight. The traders spoke with the brisk voices of those accustomed to bargaining for lives. "Strong arms," one called, "trained for field or forge." "Skilled with animals," shouted another, "knows grain from chaff." Joseph was pushed forward. The sun struck his face. He blinked but did not lower his eyes. Around him, buyers moved like shadows, scented with oil and gold. Some prodded his shoulder, testing muscle. Others spoke in tongues he barely understood. He stood silent, refusing to shrink into himself. The robe of many colors was long gone, but dignity is a garment the soul weaves anew each dawn. He kept his gaze level, and those who looked too closely felt, without knowing why, that this was not a common slave. Among the crowd came Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard, a man of middle years, tall with the air of command learned from long obedience. His cloak was trimmed with lapis, his sandals bound with gold thread. When his eyes fell on Joseph, he paused. "What is his origin?" he asked the trader. "Canaanite," the man replied, "brought from Dothan by Ishmaelites." Young, strong, unspoiled Potiphar studied him. "Does he speak Egyptian?" "Not yet." But he learns quickly. Something in Joseph's calm pleased him. "I will take him." The deal was struck. Silver changed hands. The chain around Joseph's wrists was removed, replaced by a mark of ownership more invisible but more binding, the will of another man. They crossed the river by boat. The Nile glittered like molten bronze, and the oars moved through its skin with slow, ceremonial grace. On the far bank, palm groves led to Potiphar's estate, a house of white limestone surrounded by gardens where water sang through channels and lotus floated like pale moons. Servants bowed as they entered. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed with cedar and blue lotus. Walls were painted with stories, gods weighing hearts, boats sailing to the afterlife, hunters spearing fish in silver water. Floor mosaics shimmered with turquoise and gold. Light poured through carved screens, scattering in delicate patterns like lace made of sun. Joseph was led through corridors where every footstep echoed centuries. Slaves passed silently carrying jars of beer and baskets of fruit. At the far end, in a hall open to the gardens, stood the mistress of the house. Her name was Zuleika. In the light that fell through the columns, her face seemed carved from the same pale stone that built the city, yet alive with the warmth of amber. Her eyes were lined in kohl, dark as the mouth of night. Her jewelry whispered faintly when she moved. She was not cruel, but she was accustomed to the world bending. Potiphar introduced the boy briefly. "From Canaan? Keep him in the inner court. He learns quickly." Her gaze rested on Joseph longer than decorum required. Something in the stillness of his bearing disturbed her. He looked not frightened, not submissive, but quietly apart, as if his soul had its own center that neither chains nor favor could shift. When he was led away, she continued to watch the doorway long after the sound of his steps had faded. Joseph was given a small chamber near the servants' quarters. From its window he could see a square of sky and the tops of papyrus reeds swaying beside the pool. Each morning he woke before dawn, washed in cool water, and began his tasks. He swept courtyards, poured wine, recorded measures of grain, tended lamps. His hands learned the rhythm of the house, his ears learned the language of Egypt, until words began to fall from his lips like water finding its bed. The other servants watched him with curiosity. He worked neither with fear nor pride, but with a serenity that disarmed both cruelty and suspicion. When he spoke, his voice carried quietness like a fragrance. If others mocked, he smiled. If they praised, he bent his head as though both were the same wind passing through different trees. Potiphar saw this and trusted him. Soon Joseph was given charge of accounts, then of the storehouses, then of the entire household. Everything he touched seemed to prosper, as if invisible rain followed his steps. At night, when his duties were done, he sat by the pool and watched the reflection of the moon tremble in the water. Frogs sang, and the air smelled of night-blooming jasmine. Sometimes, without thinking, he whispered his father's name. Other times, he simply listened. To the wind through palms, to the distant pulse of drums from the city, to the quiet in his own chest that still held the echo of stars booing. He dreamed again, though the dreams were simpler, of sheaves of wheat, of water rising, of light spilling from narrow places. And each morning he woke certain that his life, though small now, though hidden, was moving along a thread stretched from heaven's hand. Yet peace rarely rests untouched. In the house of Potiphar, whispers began to travel like smoke. Soft at first, then thicker, curling around corners and through corridors. The mistress lingered longer near the courtyards where Joseph worked. Servants noticed. Some smiled, others frowned. The air grew charged, as if before a storm. Joseph felt it but did not name it. He simply worked harder, prayed longer, moved through the rooms like light through lattice work. Present, unobtrusive, ungraspable. Zuleika's eyes followed him. In her chambers, perfumed lamps burned late. Outside, the garden turned blue with moonlight. Somewhere deep within, a different kind of hunger began to stir, one that no feast or jewel could satisfy. But that is for another night in the story. For now, Egypt slept under a silver sky, and within the walls of a rich man's house, a boy from Canaan learned what it meant to serve faithfully in a land of strangers. His chains were gone, but obedience itself had become a new kind of chain, a softer one, forged not of iron, but of purpose. He accepted it as one accepts the rhythm of breathing, not as punishment, but as preparation. And though he did not know it, destiny was already shifting again, quietly, like water beneath a locked door. Time in Egypt did not move as it had in Canaan. In Canaan, days had a pulse. The rhythm of sunrise over the hills, sheep bleating at dawn, the smell of bread, the closing hush of evening. But in Egypt, time was liquid. It flowed between stone columns, between the sweep of servants' feet, between the prayers that rose with the smoke of incense to gods whose faces were painted on the walls. Years passed in silence, and Joseph grew from a youth into a man. His shoulders broadened, his step deepened, and the quiet gravity of his gaze drew attention wherever he walked. The house of Potiphar had become his domain, not by arrogance, but through the slow, steady mercy of competence. Every account balanced, every field yielded, every servant obeyed him without question. Potiphar trusted him completely, He would say, half in jest, "Even the gods of Egypt favor this Hebrew." But favor can be its own peril. Within the cool chambers of the house, Zuleika moved like a presence of perfume and silk. Her days were slow, filled with rituals of luxury. Bathing in milk scented with lotus, being dressed by maids in linen whiter than moonlight, her hair braided and anointed with oils that glimmered like sun on water. Yet even in her abundance, something in her spirit had begun to ache. Her husband was away often, serving Pharaoh in the courts or leading processions through the city. The house was full of voices, but none that spoke to her soul. And every day she saw Joseph. He was no longer the trembling boy from the market. His movements carried a stillness that unsettled her, the kind that belongs not to slaves, but to those who have made peace with something unseen. He walked through the house with a grace that was both humble and regal. Zuleika watched him from balconies, from behind curtains, from the edges of her own heart. At first it was curiosity. How could someone serve so faithfully without bitterness? Then it became fascination. And fascination, when left unguarded, ripens into longing. One afternoon, she sat by the reflecting pool. The air was heavy with the scent of lotus. Joseph was in the garden, counting measures of grain stored in the side chambers. The sunlight fell through the palms, striping his robe in gold. Zuleika's maids fanned her lazily. "Bring him here," she said softly. Joseph approached, bowing slightly. "My lady." She studied him as though searching for something she had lost long ago. "Sit," she said. He hesitated. "I will stand, if it pleases you." "Does standing please you?" she asked, and there was a tremor in her voice that he did not name. He lowered his gaze. "It pleases me to serve." She smiled, but it was a wounded smile. "You serve even your own chains too well." He said nothing. Silence settled between them, vast as the desert. "Tell me," she murmured, "do your people worship one God or many?" "One," Joseph said, "but he is everywhere." "Everywhere?" she repeated, looking toward the water. "Even here?" "Yes," Joseph said gently. "Even here." Her eyes lifted to his face, and for a moment something sacred and dangerous flickered between them, the meeting of two kinds of hunger. Then she turned away. Days passed, but peace no longer lingered in her chambers. Desire is a kind of fever. It rewrites the seasons. It turns daylight into echo, and silence into voices that whisper what one dares not speak aloud. Zuleika tried to forget. She walked among her perfumes, ordered new silks, burned incense until the air shimmered. But every scent became his scent, every silence his presence. She began to dream. In her dreams, she saw him not as a servant, but as a figure of light, his face half in shadow, his eyes filled with something she could not define, mercy, perhaps, or distance. She would wake with tears on her cheeks and the taste of guilt on her tongue. The maids began to notice. They whispered behind veils. The servants moved differently when Joseph entered, aware that the air itself was shifting. Potiphar returned less often. The great house became a palace of echoes. Then came the day the story would remember forever. It was midday. The servants had gone out to the market. The house was quiet, the heat thick, the air heavy with incense and unspoken thought. Zuleika sat alone in the inner chamber, her pulse matching the slow sway of the curtains. When Joseph entered to deliver the ledgers, she turned to him. Her eyes caught the light, fierce and pleading all at once. Joseph, she said softly. He bowed. My lady. Come nearer. He hesitated, sensing the strange stillness that lives before a storm. Why do you fear me? She asked, rising. Have I not treated you well? I do not fear you, he said quietly. I fear the Lord. Her breath trembled. Then let your Lord look away. He stepped back, but her hand caught his sleeve. No one will know, she whispered. The gods of Egypt are blind, and the God of Canaan is far. Joseph's voice was low, steady. He is never far. For a heartbeat, she held him. Then, angered by his calm, she reached again, clutching his robe. It tore as he turned and fled. The cloth fell from her hand like the last leaf of a burning tree. He ran into the courtyard, breath sharp, heart hammering with shame and sorrow. Not for himself, but for her. In the pool's reflection, he saw the sky blazing white, as if heaven itself had witnessed the moment and said nothing. When Potiphar returned that evening, Zuleika's maid found her trembling, the torn robe in her hands. She cried out, "The Hebrew you brought among us mocked me. He came to dishonor your house, but I called for help, and he fled, leaving his garment beside me." The servants whispered. Potiphar's face darkened. He sent for Joseph. Joseph stood before him, the evening light falling across his face. "My lord," he said calmly, "I am innocent. The garment she holds was torn as I fled her presence." Potiphar looked between them, the fear in her eyes, the peace in his. And something within him twisted. He could not bring himself to condemn his wife, nor could he disbelieve the man who had never once lied. "Take him to the prison of Pharaoh," he said at last, voice heavy. They bound Joseph's wrists again, and the iron bit into the same flesh where chains had once been. He said nothing as they led him through the torch-lit corridors, past pillars that whispered his name, through gates that moaned like beasts in the wind. The prison was beneath the city, a hollow carved from stone, damp and smelling of rust and old sorrow. Chains rattled in the dark, footsteps echoed. The guards shoved him into a narrow cell lit by a single slit of moonlight. He sank to the floor. The cold seeped into his bones, but peace, strangely, did not leave him. He thought of his father's words. Not all hearts can bear the light that shines upon you. Now he understood. He closed his eyes. "My lord," he whispered, "you were with me in the pit, with me in the house, with me in this night. Wherever you are, that is home outside." Egypt slept. The river murmured beyond its walls. And in the prison, a dreamer waited, not for freedom, but for the hour when dreams themselves would open the doors. And so the boy from Canaan became a servant in the house of the mighty. Yet even as silence surrounded him, the light of his dreams still burned quietly within. The world had turned its face away, but heaven had not forgotten. Somewhere in the stillness of the night, a divine plan continued to weave its unseen thread through sorrow, preparing the dreamer for what would come next. For the pit and the palace are not opposites. They are two doors of the same destiny. The story of prophet Joseph, the dreamer among the stars, continues soon on Sleepy Legentale.